After a mysterious solar event, everyone went blind, and plants with the ability to move started killing. Somewhere in the jungle, under a torrential downpour, a woman with bloodied eyes pushes through the thick brush. She crawls to the porch of a house and desperately calls out for Billy. Years later, an adult man stares at a photograph of his mother. It's been 30 years since a triffid killed her. She had tried to understand what triffids truly were, friends or foes. Now, he's searching for the same answers. He had always taken them seriously, but to the rest of the world, triffids were nothing more than a resource. Their oil quickly replaced natural fuels, and humanity never stopped to consider the consequences. Despite his warnings, no one listened. Donning specialized gear, Bill heads to the greenhouses. Along the way, he meets a colleague, and together they attach sensors to a triffid. Through their research, Bill theorizes that triffids respond to sound waves, and their reaction times decrease with each new generation. They're evolving on their own. Cultivating these plants comes at a cost. Oil companies have been forced to isolate plantations and keep their operations under tight security. At the main entrance, a car pulls up. As with all vehicles, armed guards check the driver's clearance. After confirming the documents, they allow the car to pass. Once inside, the intruder makes his way to the greenhouses. He scans his surroundings before noticing a door marked high-risk zone. Entering, he finds isolated plants, capturing the scene on camera. Security spots him on the monitors, and a woman in charge orders an immediate response team. While staff rush to the greenhouse, the intruder continues filming. The woman reaches the high-risk zone first and decides not to wait for backup. At the same time, Bill runs toward the area as well. Moments later, he arrives to find his colleague on the ground and the intruder standing nearby. The man demands answers about what's going on. Listening carefully and glancing around, Bill asks him to return the woman's glasses so they can talk. Ignoring the request, the intruder throws them aside and accuses Bill of stealing oil from the triffids. Noticing the plants closing in, Bill begs the man to give her his own glasses. When the intruder finally complies, Bill discreetly pulls out a stun gun and shocks him in the leg. The man collapses, but a creeping triffid vine lashes at Bill's face. Crying out in pain, he falls. At that moment, the security team storms in, subdues the intruder, and locks him in a secure room. The woman quickly rushes Bill to a hospital in London. Meanwhile, a radio broadcast announces an extraordinary light show. Even Hawaii will see the northern lights. The program hosts an astrophysicist, who explains the phenomenon. It's a solar storm, he says, a nuclear explosion of incredible power. Billions of tons of irradiated plasma are hurtling toward Earth. But don't worry, it's completely harmless to humans. Enjoy the fireworks. Thanking the scientist, the host promises live coverage from around the globe. At the hospital, Bill undergoes eye surgery. The doctor's prognosis is grim. He has a 50% chance of losing his vision entirely. A bit later, the BBC begins live coverage of the phenomenon from various countries. The host, Jo, marvels at the extraordinary sky, but her boss interrupts, asking her to head down to the metro and interview people there about why they're choosing to miss the spectacle. Smiling, she leaves the frame. Bill's surgery concludes, and his colleague assures him she'll return for him. She checks when he'll regain consciousness, and the doctor estimates it won't be for at least 24 hours. The doctor apologizes, lamenting that Bill will miss the solar fireworks. As she returns to the farm, the sky takes on a strikingly unusual hue, and everyone eagerly anticipates the dazzling event. The moment arrives, crowds gaze up at the sky, and airplane passengers press their faces to the windows. Yet, two men remain indifferent to the storm. One is the intruder locked in a room at the farm, hiding his face beneath his hoodie. The other is a passenger on the plane, wearing a sleep mask and a cap pulled low. Seconds later, a blinding flash lights up the sky. Broadcast signals abruptly cut out, screams erupt, and people shield their faces in panic. Bill regains consciousness, a bandage over his eyes, and tries calling for a nurse. Hearing strange screams, he decides to investigate on his own. Stumbling into the hallway, he pushes through panicked, wailing patients until he reaches a mirror. Slowly removing the bandage, he's overwhelmed with relief. His sight is intact. On the plane, the masked man wakes to chaos. An emergency alert comes through the intercom as panic spreads. Grabbing inflatable life vests from fellow passengers, he locks himself in the lavatory, stacking the vests around him. Meanwhile, the plane, out of control, plummets toward the ground. Back at the hospital, an elated Bill returns to his room. Glancing out the window, he hears the roar of engines. In the next instant, a plane hurtles past the building, shedding pieces of metal. One shard crashes through the window, knocking Bill to the ground. A moment later, with a deafening screech, the plane crashes onto a bustling street. From the wreckage, the masked man emerges, stunned to be alive. Bill, now dressed, tries to leave the hospital. At the reception desk, he encounters his doctor, who informs him that everyone has been blinded by the solar storm. Promising to find help, Bill steps outside and is confronted with a grim scene. Blind survivors stumbling through the streets, surrounded by lifeless bodies sprawled across the roads. Jo regains consciousness on a collapsed escalator in the metro. She calls out for help, but no one responds. The man from the plane surveys his surroundings and spots a clothing store. Picking up a brick, he smashes the store's window. Still without any help, Joe steps outside and is met with utter chaos. She picks up a little girl's toy and asks the mother what happened. The mother explains that everyone is blind and pleads for help. Hearing that someone with sight is nearby, a crowd begins to press in, demanding assistance. Terrified, Joe struggles to break free, but the crowd only grows. Finally, she manages to escape, jumping into a nearby car and speeding off. However, she crashes into another vehicle moments later. A police officer approaches, and she begs him for help. But he, like everyone else, is blind and takes her hostage. Seeing the cop, Bill rushes toward him to ask for help but stops when he sees Joe with a gun pointed at her. Realizing she's done nothing wrong, he disarms the officer and helps Joe flee the growing mob. Meanwhile, the man from the plane, ignoring the surrounding chaos, strolls down the street in his new suit, a box of champagne in hand. He spots a dead cop near a car and carefully takes the officer's gun. Bill and Joe run into a side street, where they introduce themselves. The scientist tells her he's heading to the government to figure out what's happening and to find out how long the electricity will last. If the triffid farms are cut off from power, a disaster will unfold. Locked in the farm, the criminal, seeing and hearing the chaos around him, escapes his cell. He heads straight to the computer systems, unlocking all the doors. His plan is to free the triffids from the locked gardens and greenhouses. The next morning, Bill and Joe head toward the government building. As they walk, Joe asks how Bill missed the solar storm, and he explains that he was undergoing eye surgery. As they near the building's gates, they encounter a panicked, blind crowd demanding help. Pushing through the crowd, they ask the police to let them in, but as the mob presses in more forcefully, the blinded guards open fire, shooting wildly, hitting both the innocent and the guilty. Bill and Joe, ducking low, miraculously make it out of the gates unharmed. After moving to a safer distance, Bill spots the Prime Minister on a balcony. He shouts, trying to stop him, but in horror, they watch as the Prime Minister steps off the edge. Rushing over, they find him dead. Bill decides to look for a car to drive to the farm, and Joe insists on coming with him. They find a police car with keys still inside and head out of the city. Arriving at the farm, Bill is shocked by the sight of dead bodies. He's puzzled, how could the power have gone out so quickly? As he continues his search, he finds the bodies of the triffid male specimens in the garden, along with a dead criminal. He must have released them. The plants are carnivorous and happily devour humans. Further on, he finds Lucy's body. She too had gone blind but had fought until the end. Horrified by the scene, Joe wonders why no one had warned them about just how dangerous these plants truly are. Entering the laboratory, Bill suggests that Joe rest on the couch while he continues his work. Before lying down, Joe asks him to take her to her father, who lives near the farms. Some time later, Joe hears strange sounds and gets up to see what her new companion is doing. Bill is listening carefully to the noises, which are being made by the triffids. He's trying to decipher their communication. This is part of his work. He has already proven that they have intelligence but has not yet cracked their language. After finishing, he tells Joe that they are heading to her father's place. On the way, he explains that there are 10,000 such farms in the world, with only 500 in England, and each farm holds about 20,000 triffids. The carnivorous plants reproduce like regular plants, with males pollinating females, which is why they were kept separated. Now, they are free. Arriving at the house, Joe enters but finds no sign of her father. Suddenly, she hears a scream and rushes toward it. Bill tries to stop her, but she's already too far ahead. When she gets closer, she sees her father's body being dragged by a triffid. She shoots the plant several times, freeing her father, but he is already dead. Struggling to pull Joe away from her father, Bill drags her away from the scene. Back in the city, on a bridge, Joe notices something strange and asks Bill to stop the car. They get out and see triffids below, and Bill insists that they need to warn people. Meanwhile, the man from the plane is wandering through the empty city. Leaving the bridge, Bill and Joe head to the BBC radio station. Joe goes on air with Bill to talk about the dangers of the triffids and how to protect oneself from them. The best method, they explain, is to stay as far away from them as possible and help blind people do the same. After the broadcast ends, Bill opens up to Joe about his parents. They were botanists who studied triffids in Zaire. Bill was 6 years old when he lived with them. His father discovered that a small genetic modification could produce an endless supply of oil, which allowed for the creation of cheap, renewable biofuel. This solved the energy crisis. However, his mother believed that this should not be done. After listening to Bill, Joe asks what happened to his parents. Bill tells her that his father is alive but that they don't speak and don't get along. His mother was killed by a triffid in Zaire. After their conversation, they step onto the balcony, witnessing chaos, panic, and hearing screams as buildings burn. At the same time, the man from the plane arrives at Downing Street SW1, City of Westminster. He approaches the door and pushes it open. Inside, he meets the secretary, Hilda, and informs her that he needs to meet with the Prime Minister. Hilda asks him to schedule an appointment and tries to block his way, but Torrens, seeing that she is blind, simply walks past her and heads up to the office. Back in her room, Joe is crying, and Bill enters. She asks him to stay with her. The next morning, Hilda enters the Prime Minister's office and tells Torrance that he shouldn't be there. She doesn't know where the government officials are, they've simply disappeared. She also brought a radio with her because there's an emergency broadcast. Torrance suggests they listen to it, and when the radio is switched on, they hear Joe and Bill's broadcast about the triffids. Feeling that nothing important will come from the broadcast, Torrance suggests they have breakfast together, and later, they can take a ride. After some time, Bill walks over to the windows and notices signal flares in the distance. He immediately goes to wake Joe. They're not the only ones who haven't gone blind. As soon as it gets light outside, the two friends head toward the building where the signals came from. Along the way, they see abandoned cars and mangled bodies, victims of the triffids. They also spot a man unloading something from an abandoned vehicle. Stopping to talk to him, they learn his name is Torrance. After hearing a radio message, he decided to stock up on weapons. Bill and Joe tell him they've found a group of sighted people and are going to meet up with them, offering to let him join them. But he refuses. After a moment of thought, Bill asks why Torrance hasn't gone blind. The man explains that he's a naval submarine engineer. When the solar flare hit, he was conducting a routine repair, unlike his comrades. With that, Torrance bids them farewell and drives off. When they arrive at the building, Bill and Joe see armed soldiers facing a crowd of blind people and their leader, a sighted man. He demands that they help these people by giving them water, food, and aid. But the soldiers refuse, firing a warning shot over their heads to disperse the crowd. Bill and Joe push their way through the panicked crowd and join the soldiers. Inside, they find out that 30 sighted people and 10 blind specialists have gathered here, and they even have their own generator. After hearing Michelle's thoughts, Bill asks how they plan to fight the triffids. She responds that it's not their main concern. She's more worried about nuclear power stations, and she thinks the plants are harmless and contained on farms. The scientist tells her that the triffids are already free and will start multiplying rapidly in just a few days. However, Michelle insists that it's still not their priority. Food, shelter, and weapons are the immediate concerns. Meanwhile, the sighted man continues trying to help the blind crowd. A car approaches, and Torrance steps out. He's immediately brought to Major Cocker, where he offers his assistance. At this time, Michelle calls for a general meeting. Destruction is everywhere, and they need to rebuild society from scratch. The situation is probably the same in other countries, so they can't rely on outside help. Since resources are scarce, they won't be able to help the blind. Hearing all of this, Joe realizes she doesn't want to stay with these people and goes off to find Bill. She finds him downstairs near a car. He's planning to leave for his father's place to look for a way to fight the triffids. Perhaps his research will offer a solution. Joe wants to go with him, but the scientist convinces her that she'll be safer staying with these people. Reluctantly, she agrees, and he drives off. However, he doesn't get far before the building is attacked by armed men, Cocker, Torrance, and their followers. They take the supplies and the sighted people with them. After bringing the sighted people to their shelter, they were divided into groups and chained to the blind. Then, everyone was loaded into vehicles and sent out in search of food. The first stop was by a bar. Bursting in, they found the former owner of the establishment, and one of Torrance's followers was about to kill him. But Bill stopped him. As they settled in the hall, the scientist took out a recorder with sounds of triffids on it. Torrance then told Joe that Major Cocker wanted to see her. He had learned that she was the one who sent the message about the plants over the radio. The Major wanted to fix the radio transmitter and thought that since people recognized her voice, she could communicate with them and calm them down. But she refused to go anywhere. After a while, Cocker, along with a group of blind and sighted people, headed to a warehouse for supplies. After looking around, Bill said it wasn't safe to go there, but the Major didn't listen. He warned Joe to be careful, and they parted ways. As they loaded food onto carts, they noticed the bodies of people. In one of the rooms, a woman found a triffid. It knocked her down and grabbed her by the leg. Another triffid attacked Torrance's assistant, but he managed to knock the plant's limbs off the bartender. Bill ran as fast as he could to help Joe. With fire, he was able to free her, but just as he did, the triffid struck Hilda in the face. Meanwhile, Cocker found another woman trapped under some boxes and helped her out. Together, they ran outside, only to see several dead bodies. It was then that the Major finally understood what the scientist had been trying to tell him all this time. Realizing his mistake, Cocker freed Bill. At that moment, Torrance pulled up. Angrily, Cocker told him that Osman was a coward and that he didn't need people like him. The scientist would now be part of their team, and he needed to give Cocker everything he had to fight the triffids. The man reluctantly agreed. Back at the bar, Joe told Torrance she wanted to help and was willing to do the broadcast for the Major. Afterward, she and Bill would go to his father's place. Torrance was thrilled that she had changed her mind and suggested she record a few things right away. As soon as Joe left, the scientist began preparing for the journey. Joe went live on air, announcing to everyone who could hear her that the triffids had reached the major cities of the country. Since these plants were killing people, Major Cocker called for everyone to fight back. All volunteers were to join the military, who would be arriving in their area. Hearing Joe's broadcast, Bill rushed to the window and saw Torrance's armed men forcing everyone into vehicles. The scientist tried to escape, but Osman and his associates blocked the exit and shot him in the shoulder. As soon as the broadcast ended, Joe was taken away as well. Bill comes to his senses at the sound of Cocker's screams. Both of them, bound, are being driven in a vehicle to the Hampstead marshes. The Major tells him that Torrance orchestrated everything, and now he's in charge, setting the rules. Jo is brought to a new house, and Torrance gives her one of the best rooms. He also informs her that Bill had been helping Cocker during a recent triffid attack. He saved many blind people's lives, but he himself didn't make it. Not believing what she's heard, the broadcaster begins to cry bitterly. Meanwhile, Osman and his companion are taking the men to the marshes. On the way, the Major manages to untie his hands and helps Bill free himself. At that moment, the vehicle stops, and one of the men gets out to check on the prisoners. He sees they've escaped their bonds and points a weapon at them. However, before he can do anything, a triffid attacks him and drags him into the darkness. Witnessing this, Osman frantically tries to start the car and drive away, but Cocker attacks him. However, another triffid intervenes, grabbing both men. Wanting to help the Major, Bill opens fire on the plant. After freeing themselves, the men are about to get into the vehicle to leave, but Osman stops them. Throwing the car keys at him, the men step back and see a multitude of carnivorous plants behind him. Seeing that the plants are surrounding them, Bill and Cocker begin to back away. Osman, trying to stop them, fires a shot into the air, but it does no good, and the scientist throws a recording device with the sound of a triffid playing at his feet. Immediately after, the plant attacks the villain. Realizing they have little chance of escaping the marshes, the men rush to get in the truck. With difficulty, Cocker starts the engine and speeds off. After some time, the truck stalls. Waking Bill, the Major tells him that they'll have to continue on foot. He hopes the snow will slow the triffids down, but the scientist says they adapt quickly to any conditions. Meanwhile, Jo is again broadcasting a message to all people, informing them that in London, there is a place where they can find protection, food, and shelter. In the meantime, Bill and Cocker make it to a monastery. There, the injured man receives medical attention, and his shoulder wound is cleaned and stitched up. The abbess, who comes out to meet them, expresses her joy at their arrival and hopes they will stay with them. At Torrance's headquarters, new arrivals report that some areas are under their control, while others are still controlled by the triffids. Looking at a map, Jo comments that the plants are everywhere, and if Bill were alive, he could help. She then asks what the Major's next plan is. With a sigh, Torrance says that Cocker has lost heart, and now everything depends on people like them. Everyone present says they came because they heard Jo's broadcast. Trying to change the subject, Torrance invites the broadcaster to dinner, but she declines. After recovering, Bill and the Major are on the roof of the monastery, looking through binoculars. In the distance, they spot triffids. However, the scientist is puzzled as to why they aren't attacking, considering there is little food around. Cocker is also puzzled and had asked Duran about this. Meanwhile, the abbess is seeing Father Thomas off on a missionary journey. She is saddened to see the best of their people leave, but he wants to spread word of them to others. He will find other survivors and build a new community. Hearing this, the Major is impressed by the elderly man's resolve, while Bill asks why the triffids aren't attacking the monastery. Duran responds that at first, the plants did attack, but then the Lord intervened. He listened to their prayers, and the triffids retreated into the forest, no longer killing anyone. The scientist is astonished by this behavior of the carnivorous plants. Cocker mentions that he saw a generator in the basement and offers to repair it, but Duran refuses. She doesn't want life to be easy, it must be right, accompanied by hard work. After some thought, Bill decides to go on a journey. They need to find a way to defeat the triffids, or humanity will perish. The abbess decides to help him and draws a map of a safe route through the forest. After saying goodbye to the people at the monastery and to Cocker, Bill sets off. In the city, Torrance's people are building barricades against the triffids. While inspecting the constructions, Jo asks her guide where Osman is, as she hasn't seen him for a while. He tells her that Osman's remains were found in the marshes, and nothing was left of Bill and Cocker. Hearing this, the broadcaster realizes that the men are most likely still alive. Dr. Mason follows the forest route shown to him. Suddenly, he notices bodies, clearly eaten by the triffids, and among them is Father Thomas. As he turns to the noise behind him, he sees the carnivorous plants. Meanwhile, Jo decides to sneak into Torrance's office. She opens his suitcase and finds Bill's belongings. Taking them, she quietly leaves his room and returns to her own. A few minutes later, she is called to conduct a live broadcast. An angry man returns from the forest to the monastery. He walks straight into a service and sees that Duran has chosen a new victim for the triffids. He tells everyone present that the abbess is sending people to the plants as sacrifices. She tries to justify her actions, but the others no longer want her there and expel her from the monastery. At the same time, Jo is speaking on air. At the monastery's doorstep, just before Bill leaves, Cocker hands him a radio and informs him that Jo is alive. After saying goodbye, the scientist sets off again. After finishing her broadcast, Jo returns to her room, only to find Torrance waiting for her. He didn't like her words and is curious to know who the message was meant for. The broadcaster tells him it was for her dead father. She missed the chance to be with him and doesn't want a repeat of that. That's why she decided to accept his dinner invitation. The man, pleased, says that he sees her fear and will protect her, promising he will do a much better job than the late Cocker. She wonders why he didn't say this sooner. Torrance replies that he didn't want to upset her further. They agree to have dinner together after the evening broadcast, and he leaves. Meanwhile, Bill continues his journey to Shiring to find his father. In the evening, Jo goes on air as usual. However, this time she tells her audience that it's not worth coming to London. There, people will be forced to die so that the new government can live in luxury and comfort. Furious, Torrance, along with his men, immediately heads to the broadcaster. But when he enters the studio, he finds it empty, only her voice is recorded on a tape recorder. Even angrier, he orders his men to find her. The guys immediately begin searching, but Jo manages to hide. Troy, who spots her, distracts the others, preventing them from seeing her. Once the others leave, he throws her his flashlight and wishes her good luck. After waiting for the others to leave, the broadcaster sneaks out from behind the barricade and heads to find a car. On one of the streets, she encounters a group of triffids. After a difficult escape, she hides in a building, but the plants find her there as well. After finding car keys, she rushes outside and gets into a vehicle. With trembling hands, she manages to start it and drive away. Once out of the city, she heads toward Bill's father's place. As she looks at the map, Jo doesn't notice a cluster of abandoned cars ahead and narrowly avoids a collision, wrecking her vehicle in the process. At this time, Bill reaches the town. However, he is greeted with gunfire. Raising his hands, he begs them not to shoot. Two teenage girls step forward. He introduces himself and tells them where he's heading. After listening to him, Susan and Imogen propose a deal. They'll give him a car if he takes them along. Agreeing, the man and the girls continue their journey. Having lost her car, Jo continues on foot. Suddenly, she hears a vehicle approaching from behind and, thinking it's Torrance, she starts running. However, she doesn't get far, tripping over a log and losing consciousness. Bill and the girls arrive in Shiring. There, they meet an approaching car. Telling the girls to stay in the car, the scientist steps outside and sees his father stepping out of the second car. Recognizing each other, the men and the girls head to the house. Inside, the father leads everyone into the house, and Bill meets Jo. Not believing her eyes, the woman hugs her friend, shocked that he survived and somehow ended up with children. They head to her room, where she returns his belongings and then plays a record. The pair begins to dance and eventually shares a kiss. Meanwhile, Torrance, holding a rifle, sits on his bed. Outside, screams and gunfire are heard. Troy enters to deliver bad news, but Torrance dismisses him. At the mansion, Old Man Mason shows his son a plan to fight the triffids. He proposes developing a new species of plant whose pollen will not fertilize, but sterilize the others. To do this, they need to collect the pollen from a male triffid, modify it, and fertilize a young female. The female will produce spores containing a sterility gene. However, Bill is not enthusiastic about the plan. Seeing this, his father tells him that he's very much like his mother. She was a brilliant scientist who pursued science for the sake of science, unlike her husband, whose interests were more practical. After discussing their past a bit more, Bill finally agrees with his father's plan. They must hurry as the triffid spores will begin to mature soon. Mason says that he is almost ready, they just need to find a male. He had been hunting for one near the old farm, but without success. Bill promises to get everything necessary for him. Leaving the girls in Jo's care, Bill heads for the old farm. Upon entering one of the buildings, the scientist sets up a recorder with sounds of triffids. However, instead of finding a plant, he encounters Susan. After scolding the girl for disobedience, Bill fails to notice the triffid creeping up on them. The plant grabs the girl and drags her away. Desperately crying for help, she pleads, and Bill rushes to save her. With great effort, he kills the triffid and frees Susan. Returning home, they bring the male's head to his father. Mason is surprised and asks how Bill managed to do it. Bill explains about the triffid voices, theorizing that different sounds provoke different emotions. After listening to his son, Mason reveals that his mother had the same theory. Her greatest fear was that humans might use the triffids without understanding them. After talking a bit more about her, Mason decides to give Bill the recordings of his mother from Zaire. Bill suggests that they work on them together someday. After some time, Bill, Jo, and Susan step outside, where they see triffid spores flying in from all directions. They resemble snow, and Bill is completely unprepared for such a scale. At the headquarters, Troy approaches Torrance, telling him that he has found papers at one of the farms, including the address of William Mason. Later, Bill notices a plane flying past the window. The whole family rushes outside, waving their hands to attract the pilot's attention. Behind the controls is Coker, and as the plane flies over their house, he drops some leaflets before flying away. Picking one up, the scientist reads that on the Isle of Wight, there are over 2,000 people, and they are inviting others to join them. They have families, doctors, and schools. Mason Sr. happily says that now they have a place to go after they release the new breed of triffids, and he goes to feed the female. The others remain outside, embracing joyfully. Returning to his laboratory, Mason feeds the plant and then plays recordings of his wife's voice. Hearing the recorded sounds, the triffid starts to get agitated and opens its feeding window. As Mason stands up to close it, the plant attacks him. Desperately calling for his son, he asks him to turn off the recording. Bill runs upstairs, immediately turning off the sound and rushing to his father. Realizing that there is no other option, he shoots the triffid and frees his father. However, it is too late, the triffid has released its venom, and Mason Sr. dies. Later, Bill, Joe, and the girls cremate his body. After the funeral, the couple discusses what to do next. Joe asks if it's possible to start over, but Bill replies that there's no time for that, and tomorrow they will head to the Isle of Wight. As he puts the recordings back in the drawer, he notices an African mask. Memories from his childhood, which have haunted him throughout his life, flood back. The next morning, the family is awakened by a strange sound. Joe hears her voice on the radio and realizes that something is wrong. When they go downstairs, they find Torrance and his men. Terrified for the girls, Joe rushes to Imogen, but Troy drags her away. Torrance orders that the child be taken to her sister and tied up there. He tells Bill that the triffids have infested the underground shelters and tunnels and demands that Bill find a weapon to fight them. Threatening to kill the entire family, he gives Bill until morning. Locked in a room, the scientist tries to come up with a plan for what to do next. He suggests using the sounds of the triffids to escape. They have a better chance of surviving with the carnivorous plants than with Torrance. Their conversation is interrupted when Troy enters, informing them that the man wants to see Bill downstairs. While Bill talks to Torrance, Susan quietly slips out of the house through the window and sets up the recorder. When Bill returns to his room, he learns that the girl succeeded in her plan. In the evening, one of Torrance's henchmen finds the recorder and notices a crowd of triffids beyond the fence. Enraged with Bill, Torrance sends Troy to kill the girls. Meanwhile, the family prepares to escape. Hearing a sound behind them, they see the man who came to kill them. Joe convinces him not to do it and to join them instead. Outside, Torrance hears a series of gunshots from the house, which everyone assumes is the signal for an attack by the triffids. Having staged the children's deaths, Troy joins the family and tries to help them escape. Over the radio, Torrance demands that the man activate the electric fence to protect against the advancing plants, but Troy buys time and finally claims that the fence isn't working. Seeing that his men will not hold out, Torrance returns to the house and finds that Troy has betrayed him. He shoots him in the leg and once again aims his gun at the family. But Bill proves stronger and knocks Torrance out with a stun gun. Reaching the gate, Joe opens the door, but there is a triffid standing behind it. Struggling, they manage to close the door, but not before the plant's tendrils grab at them. At this moment, Bill finally recalls everything from his childhood. He grabs the African mask and, using it, covers Imogen's eyes and then those of everyone else. This way, the poison doesn't kill them, and the triffids mistake them for their own. As a child, he was saved by one of the residents of Zaire after his mother's death. Stepping outside, they carefully make their way through the crowd of triffids. The plants study them but do not attack. Suddenly, Torrance emerges from the house behind them. He shoots at them but misses. Deciding that the plants won't harm him, he runs after the family into the midst of the triffids, but the plants entangle him with their vines and kill him. Time passes, and Bill, Joe, Susan, Imogen, and Troy, alive and well, are sailing in a boat. They are heading to a new home, where other families and new friends are waiting for them. The sea is their barrier against the triffids, and the people have managed to clear the island of the plants, allowing their community to grow. Their descendants will ask how this could have happened, how the carnivorous plants overtook the world so quickly. The answer will be simple. It happened because people didn't notice what was right in front of their eyes, even when they could have seen it. What do you think is harder, surviving in a world full of dangerous plants, or losing your sight and being forced to rely on your other senses? Share your thoughts in the comments down below, give a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next videos.